The Derinkuyu Expedition, Part 1. Entries taken from the Journal of Eleanor L. Harrow.
Context. Derinkuyu is an ancient underground city in Turkey, carved deep into volcanic rock. It stretches 85 meters below the surface and once housed up to 20,000 people, complete with homes, schools, churches and even stables. Originally built around the 8th century BC, it was later expanded by Byzantine Christians, who eventually abandoned it, leaving the city untouched for centuries. Derinkuyu was rediscovered by accident in 1963, when a man in the Turkish town above it was renovating his home. While knocking down a wall in his basement, he unexpectedly uncovered a hidden tunnel. As he explored further, he realized the tunnel led to a vast, underground, multi-level city buried beneath the earth.
Part 1. The dust had settled in the air, turning the glow of our kerosene lanterns into a muted haze against the ancient stone walls that surrounded us. It had taken longer than expected to find the entrance to the lower levels, and our battery-powered torches had already died. The empty ruins were even more vast than legends had said. The upper levels had already been picked clean by raiders, and the treasures they had taken were now likely scattered across the globe. But what my uncle had uncovered since was something far older. Beneath the known ruins, beneath the already looted corridors, lay yet more levels, older, untouched, unmapped. The Byzantines had sealed these levels off from the outside world many centuries ago and left no record of why. Whatever lay below had remained there, unclaimed, ever since. But now, our small team stood before the sealed passage, the last barrier of rock between the upper and the lower levels of this underground city, and were arguing over how to proceed. Guy Mercer stood tall, arms crossed in frustration, a rugged American, built for adventure. He had the posture of a man who had already decided what was right. You think whoever built this thing left us a neat little door? They buried it for a reason. Dynamite is the only way through. Dr. Miriam Voss was perpetually uneasy and stood rigid with tension, her Spanish accent sharper when frustrated. Destroying the structure risks damaging relics, she argued. The findings we have from the upper levels alone will take months to properly study. Why rush this? But Richard Harrow, my uncle, was not a man driven by patience. He was driven by money. He was a stylish man, wearing tailored expedition clothes that looked more fashionable than practical. He gave Miriam a look that suggested he had tired of the argument, the type of look my family gave to their servants when they no longer wanted to hear their opinion. "Crumbs are all we've been left up here," he said smoothly. "And while I appreciate your concerns, I didn't fund this little venture for an intellectual jolly. No one will pay me for your reports. But they will pay for relics. And deeper means older. That's where the real value is. Down there." He pointed below the surface. Across from him, Haluk Demir, our local guide, stood slightly apart from the group, his eyes locked on the markings carved into the stone floor. He had refused to touch the entrance when we first uncovered it. "We should leave it alone," he muttered. "Some things are buried for a reason." My uncle explained that since they weren't technically there legally, an earlier revelation that had shocked Miriam and amused Mercer, time was of the essence. It was now or never. I remember thinking it felt as though the walls of Derinkuyu were listening to us, as though they had heard conversations like ours before, maybe many times over the centuries. Mercer reached for the detonator. His beloved dynamite was already wired against the stone. Miriam shook her head in disbelief, although she clearly had every intention of venturing inside. Haluk turned away, whispering something I didn't understand, and I just wrote it all down, as much as I could. My uncle had brought me along to document his trip, and preferably to make him sound heroic in the process. So document it I would, much to my horror. Mercer ignited the explosives, and an explosion echoed through the ruins like the sound of an atomic bomb. The result was a large hole carved into the rock floor, and so in we went. The Derinkuyu Expedition, Part 2. We left most of our things on the upper levels, taking only the kerosene lanterns, a few excavation tools, and several padded cases for transporting whatever we found. Mercer was the first to climb through the hole. The rest of us followed after him. The steep decline meant a rope was required to steady our descent. Below, we found more tunnels, similar in size to the ones above, except these were clearly untouched by time, dating back almost 2,000 years. My uncle looked very satisfied with himself. See, I told you there was more to this place. I remember thinking something felt wrong. The lavish tiles from above were now gone. The familiar Byzantine carvings and Christian inscriptions had been replaced by crude etchings clawed into the stone, erratic and unstructured images of figures hunched over, most of them grossly deformed, scratched deep into the rock as though by desperate hands. I had thought Haluk would refuse to join us on the lower levels, but he followed also. Perhaps my uncle's money outweighed his fear. "There is a legend," he murmured. "The original builders of this city were cruel. They forced slaves deep into the earth, so deep they may have survived even after their masters perished." Mercer peered around at many of the broken columns that marked entrances into deeper caverns. "Earthquakes," he declared with great confidence. "Buried them alive, no doubt." Dr. Miriam's fingers hovered over the stone, tracing the uneven carvings that depicted sickness and death. "Disease, perhaps?" she said. "Could explain why people were left down here and intentionally sealed in." Richard barely glanced at the walls. "Does it matter? I can't take the walls home with me." He adjusted his jacket, flicking dust from his sleeve. "The Byzantines sealed this place off, but they did it in a hurry. If treasures were left, we get first dibs." "Maybe it was God's will," Haluk said, "smiting them from existence." Miriam asked him, "You mean the people who were left down here, or the ones who did the leaving?" "Both," Haluk answered. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, threading through the stone and curling through the air. "Can anyone hear that?" I asked. "Yes," my uncle replied. "The wind. The first fresh air in here for over 2,000 years." Ahead, Mercer had already wandered deeper into the chambers. His torch flickered through the dust to reveal something brilliant. A grand altar, covered in gold, gleaming beneath centuries of silence. Mercer peered up in amazement, but I had noticed something too. Bones, scattered around its base, broken and brittle, some stacked, some strewn, as if left there with a deliberate intent. Miriam had noticed them also. "Small animal bones, mostly," she said. "Mostly," Haluk repeated. My uncle raised his arms wide, almost in worship of the altar. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you success?" And then they attacked. The Derinkuyu Expedition, Part 3. Mercer and my uncle wasted no time, hands sweeping across the golden altar, fingers brushing against ornate relics and ancient coins, trying to calculate which was worth the most, but weighed the least. I remember how the treasure glittered beneath the lantern's glow, proof of what we had found beyond the sealed passage. Miriam knelt beside the bones, her brow furrowed as she traced the jagged remains. "These aren't ceremonial," she murmured, half to herself. "They're broken, some shattered." She lifts a larger bone into the light. "Some are human." Haluk stood apart from the group, his voice a whisper, praying in an ancient dialect. A shape caught my attention at the very edge of the lantern's reach. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, the uneven stone shifting beneath the glow, but then it stepped forward, hunched and unnatural, with pale eyes staring into the blackness, sniffing the air. It was human, barely. I screamed, The creature lunged, scuttling across the ground like a half-starved, half-crazed animal, its hands acting like forelegs, propelling it forward with surprising speed. I remember being frozen with fear as it leapt forward, clawed hands outstretched toward me, until Mercer tackled it out of the air, slamming the creature's twisted form into the stone. A struggle erupted, with Mercer trying to get a grip around the creature's throat as it clawed at him, shrieking in some half-formed language. Then a second creature erupted from the darkness, barreling toward Miriam. She barely had time to turn before it was on her, bony fingers curling around her arm, teeth snapping dangerously close to her throat. Richard shouted as his own attacker began clawing at his face, long fingernails scraping deep, tearing into his skin. Halleck dug into his backpack and removed a revolver. I later discovered this was Mercer's gun. It was illegal for him to carry in Turkey, so Halleck had hidden it, who now called out, "Mercer!" as he tossed the revolver to the American. Mercer caught the weapon in one hand and didn't hesitate, blasting a hole in the creature's head. Mercer stood over the creature, its body limp, with dark blood pooling beneath it. "Mercer!" Richard's voice called out, his attacker clinging to his shoulder, nails digging deep into his flesh, its mouth biting his throat. Mercer turned, steadied his aim, and fired. The creature let out a guttural cry as the shot tore into its side. It recoiled, staggering backwards, before retreating into the blackness beyond the lantern's reach. Mercer quickly turned his aim to where Miriam should have been, but she was gone. The Derinkuyu Expedition, Part 4. Richard was bleeding badly. Mercer and Haluk carried him between them. The stolen treasures were packed tightly in their sacks, clattering against their backs as they climbed back into the upper levels. It was Richard who spoke first, between painful breaths. "Miriam is gone," he rasped. "We should leave." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Good to know how quickly you'd leave me to die." "It's not leaving," Richard countered, his voice sharp with pain. "If they're already dead." Silence. It was then that I heard it. Amidst the echoes there were whispers threading through the stone. Voices. Most made no sense, but one did. It was faint and trembling, her cadence breaking, but there was no doubt it was Miriam. She was alive, reciting names somewhere down below. The others heard it too this time, and we all listened closely. She was repeating the names of Byzantine emperors, Heraclius, Justinian, Constantine the Great. Her voice was unsteady but rhythmic. A coping mechanism, according to Mercer. Something to hold on to keep her mind intact. I almost laughed in relief. The city was built with ingenious acoustics, Halleck explained, a way for its people to speak underground across great distances. Her voice should get louder the closer we get to her. Mercer began counting his bullets. 10 shots, he muttered. He set the dynamite at Richard's feet. "Light it when we get out," he ordered. "Take down the column next to the hole. Bury us all if we don't make it." Richard nodded weakly. Halleck joined Mercer, and the two men climbed back down the rope and disappeared into the darkness, following the sound of Miriam's voice. I climbed down to the bottom of the rope, holding my barely flickering lantern to light their escape. "I'm sorry, Ellie," my uncle called down from above. "I dragged you into this," he said. "You're the best writer I know. I wanted your words for my story, of how we found this place." "I write fiction," I called back. My uncle let out a strained laugh. "Most non-fiction is fiction." He paused. "I'll make it up to you, I promise." "Then make sure you live," I told him. My eyes then turned to the walls around me. The scratched artworks were barely visible beneath the grime. On closer inspection, the creatures seemed to be in a state of worship. A shield, similar to the large golden one my uncle had taken from the altar, was grasped in their hands, like a sacred relic. The creatures' heads were bowed around it. Had they seen something divine in the depths of the earth? Something they had clung to for centuries, even as their minds and bodies had deteriorated. I shuddered at the thought. Then, gunshots. 6 in rapid fire, followed by silence. I peered into the darkness, but could see nothing. Hopefully, Mercer was reloading. Then, 2 more shots. Mercer had 2 bullets left. Another shot. 1 left. That's when they emerged. Mercer, Haluk, and Miriam, running full tilt out of the darkness. Miriam was wounded, and Mercer was half dragging her along. Behind them, an ungodly number of creatures barreled forward, screeching and crawling over one another in a frantic pursuit. Mercer fired his last shot, hitting the closest creature squarely in the chest, sending it flying backwards. He then tossed his gun to one side and pulled Miriam forward, but they weren't moving fast enough. They weren't going to make it. The Derinkuyu Expedition, Part 5. "The shield! Throw it down!" I shouted up to my uncle. He hesitated, his grip tightening around the ornate shield beside him. Gold inlaid, adorned with intricate designs. It was an undeniably expensive prize, and he didn't want to part with it. "Do it!" I screamed. I could see he wasn't happy about it, but he still threw it down. The shield clattered into the rubble beside me. I quickly hoisted it above my head, standing tall atop the uneven stones, my lantern casting long shadows across the chamber. The charging creatures had become a swarm of pale-eyed horrors, hands scraping against the stone, desperate and ravenous. But then they stopped, suddenly silent, taking deep breaths, similar to Mercer, Haluk, and Miriam, who raced past me, desperately trying to get Miriam back to the upper levels. The creature's pale eyes seemed to stare vacantly at the shield above my head as they slowly knelt around me. Somewhat unceremoniously for poor Miriam, Mercer and Haluk managed to get the doctor back into the upper levels with my uncle. The creatures shuffled closer, their forms hulking and grotesque. Centuries in the dark had twisted them, morphed them beyond recognition. A community once abandoned and left to rot. "Climb, kid!" Mercer shouted. I dropped the shield, and it clattered to the floor, its effect on the creatures unraveling. The kneeling figures now rose, their reverence replaced once more by rage. I scrambled up the rubble using the rope as fast as I could. My heart was pounding. My hands kept slipping, the rope burning my skin. I could hear one of the creatures climbing up behind me. I almost fell in panic, but Mercer and Haluk grabbed me and pulled me up. I was almost through when the creature behind me latched onto my legs, its grip iron tight, dragging itself up with me. Haluk threw his satchel to Miriam. "Please give this to my brother," he asked, before diving forward and tackling the creature that clung to my legs, forcing it back into the abyss and tumbling through the hole after it. Except he didn't, because my uncle, with the last of his strength, grabbed the back of Haluk's shirt, holding him above the hole, his fingers white-knuckled, barely keeping their grip. Below, the creatures screamed, their voices writhing through the darkness, clawing at the stone, desperate to follow us. "Mercer!" my uncle called, his voice strained. "Blow it!" Mercer hit the detonator. It clicked, and an explosion beside us caused one of the columns to collapse forward as a thunderous roar tore through the chamber. Richard and Haluk rolled out of the way at the very last moment as the rock fell, sealing the hole between the 2 levels and sending the abominations back to hell. The Derinkuyu Expedition, Part 6. Mercer chuckled as he ran a hand through his dust-caked hair, his muscles aching. Even Miriam managed something like a smirk, despite the pain in her leg. But it was my Uncle Richard who was grinning the most, his hands resting on the bulging sack of treasures beside him. He promised each of us, even me, our fair share once the sails went through. We had survived, and proceeded to limp back through the tunnels, the darkness behind us finally quiet, until I heard it. A deep, distant banging. I stopped, and my pulse automatically quickened. Another bang, this time closer, causing dust to trickle from the wall beside me. I turned sharply, scanning the stone. The others hadn't noticed yet. They were still walking ahead, exhausted and oblivious. Then, a third bang, louder, more forceful. The stone beside me trembled. "Do you hear that?" I asked the others. The three of them slowed, listening carefully. Another hit shook the wall beside me. They all heard that one. Then again, faster. Boom! 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 Mercer muttered under his breath, "Gimme a break," as he pulled a climbing spike from his pack, gripping it like a weapon. A final blow shattered a chunk of the wall, opening up a hole barely the size of a human head. We held our collective breath, bracing for the worst, until a face appeared, dust-covered, eyes wide, but normal. Recognition sparked in the man's expression. "Haluk!" Haluk exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. "My brother, Selim," he explained. Miriam let out a short laugh, half exhausted, half incredulous. "Does that mean I can get out here?" Haluk nodded. "We can." Haluk's brother drove us all to the local hospital, but not before my uncle said to Haluk, "Remember, this was your discovery. Yours and your brother's." He leaned toward Haluk. "We were never here, and you'll get slightly more than your fair share. I promise." They shook on it. The end. Thank you for listening to this Hollow Crown tale. The realm holds many more stories, and its legends are waiting for you here. Alternatively, let me know in the comments if there is a particular tale you would like me to tell.